Christmas Day, we cannot help but think of those for whom the devastating effects of conflict in the Middle East.
The glittering lie. The evening began like any other royal gala, velvet gowns brushing the marble floors, the chandeliers of Buckingham Palace burning gold, the orchestra drowning whispers beneath a polite hum of champagne laughter. I remember watching Camilla glide through the crowd that night, her smile measured, her posture deliberate. To the public eye, she was the perfect queen consort, charming, gracious, radiating stability, beside a monarch weighed down by age and scrutiny. But behind that polished poise, something sharper had begun to take shape. The event was meant to celebrate a new wave of royal charity partnerships, an initiative Charles had spent months nurturing. But what caught my attention wasn't the king. It was how the room shifted around Camilla. She moved with the ease of someone who had learned not just to survive in power, but to manipulate it. Her laugh lingered a beat too long with certain ministers. Her glances found the right reporters, and her aides, always 3 paces behind, took quiet notes of who greeted her first. Later that night, as the ballroom thinned, I overheard a whisper near the grand staircase. "She's testing the waters," one senior courtier said to another, "seeing how far she can stretch the throne before it snaps." I dismissed it at first. Palace gossip thrives on exaggeration. But as the weeks unfolded, the pattern became undeniable. Camilla's public schedule began to subtly eclipse Charles's. She appeared in photographs more frequently, often solo, addressing causes that traditionally belonged to the monarch's portfolio. The BBC called it a refreshing modernization of royal responsibilities, while The Guardian described it as a quietly effective expansion of the queen consort's influence. To outsiders, it looked like efficiency. To those within the palace, it looked like strategy. Even her tone began to change. In private briefings, she spoke less about supporting the king and more about the institution's long-term stability, phrasing that struck some as harmless, but others as deeply calculated. I began to see the shift too. Camilla no longer positioned herself as an accessory to Charles's reign, but as its co-architect. That was subtle, almost invisible to the untrained eye, but to those of us who watched closely, it was revolutionary and dangerous. Charles, ever the diplomat, dismissed early concerns. "She's simply easing my burden," he told his private secretary. But the truth was more complicated. Camilla had always understood the one rule that defines monarchy: control the narrative, and you control the legacy. She had spent decades mastering the art of public redemption, transforming herself from tabloid villain to national matriarch. And now, with Charles's health increasingly discussed in hushed tones, she was beginning to test whether that redemption could carry her further to something unthinkable, something no consort had achieved in modern history. The press, sensing blood in the water, began to speculate. Reuters noted unusual visibility around the queen consort's engagements, while Deutsche Welle hinted at a subtle redefinition of constitutional optics. Behind those diplomatic headlines lay an uncomfortable truth: Camilla was consolidating influence, not just over charities or public goodwill, but over access itself. Ministers who once waited for Charles's summons now found it easier to meet with her. Senior aides who resisted her growing authority were quietly reassigned. One evening, as I reviewed a list of official appointments, I noticed something that confirmed my unease. Several engagements originally scheduled under the king's office had been reissued under the queen's. The explanation for logistical simplicity was plausible enough, but in a system built on symbolism, it was seismic. Camilla wasn't just borrowing the king's authority, she was appropriating it. Then came the rumors of the new court, a phrase whispered among palace staff. Supposedly, a private circle of advisors, journalists, and aristocrats had begun meeting informally at Clarence's house. The meetings were described as social gatherings, yet minutes were taken, agendas circulated, and topics ranged from succession optics to royal communications policy. Charles, exhausted by the pace of state affairs, left much of the domestic stage to his wife. That vacuum, unnoticed by most, was exactly what Camilla needed. Even Al Jazeera picked up on the growing imbalance, calling her the most politically visible consort in decades. Commentators debated whether it was empowerment or encroachment. But inside Buckingham whispers, hardened into conviction she was building something parallel, something that looked like preparation. I remember the first time I allowed myself to think the unthinkable, that perhaps Camilla wasn't content to simply stand beside the crown. She had endured too much, fought too long to settle for silence. Her story had always been one of reclamation, of turning public hatred into quiet triumph. And now, perhaps that instinct had evolved into something more formidable, the will to reign in her own right. That night, as I left the palace grounds, the gold light spilling through the windows seemed colder somehow. The laughter from the ballroom echoed faintly behind me, but it no longer sounded like celebration. It sounded like the overture to something darker. A power play wrapped in pearls and politeness, hidden beneath the glittering lie of unity. Night meetings, new court. It began quietly, as every great intrigue in royal history does, not with proclamations, but with late-night gatherings. A handful of names carefully chosen began appearing regularly at Clarence House long after the official schedule ended. They were journalists, discreet MPs, and a few well-connected aristocrats whose loyalty to Camilla stretched back decades. To the outside world, these were harmless private salons. But within those candlelit rooms, I soon realized she was building something far more calculated, a court within a court. Camilla understood one truth better than anyone: power in the modern monarchy no longer lived in the throne room. It lived in perception. As Charles retreated into paperwork and protocol, she filled the void with charm and conversation. The Telegraph called it her second wind, portraying her as a seasoned stateswoman stepping into a supportive role for an overburdened king. But those who attended her gatherings knew it was more. Each meeting followed a familiar pattern: flattery, speculation, reassurance. Then, like clockwork, discussion turned toward continuity, stability, and the importance of long-term confidence in leadership. Her language was always careful, never overt. She didn't talk of replacing Charles or inheriting power. She spoke, instead of safeguarding the institution, of what might happen if the king's health failed unexpectedly, if public trust wavered, if the transition arrived before the monarchy was ready. But beneath those euphemisms was a chilling precision. She wasn't discussing survival. She was discussing succession. The BBC later reported cautiously that senior palace sources expressed concern about informal strategy sessions involving the Queen consort. Reuters referred to them as unofficial advisory meetings. But inside Buckingham, we called them what they were: the new court. One evening, as I reviewed a briefing note that had somehow been routed to the wrong office, I found her handwriting in the margins. It read simply, "Public loves familiarity. Stability must have a face." The implication was clear that face would be hers. Her strategy worked on two fronts: internal consolidation and external perception. Within the palace, she cultivated loyalty through subtle patronage. Staff who aligned with her vision found themselves promoted. Those who didn't were quietly transferred to lesser roles. A few longtime aides to the king were reassigned under the guise of streamlining. To the press, she became an indispensable figure. The Guardian noted her emerging influence over royal messaging. Deutsche Welle observed that her engagements were now more politically adjacent than ceremonial. Even her body language began to change. During public appearances, she stood half a step ahead of Charles instead of beside him. At charity events, her speeches lengthened, often ending with remarks about strong leadership in uncertain times. The phrasing mirrored language used in government press briefings, no accident. Her communications team, recruited from outside traditional palace circles, had begun drafting statements that positioned her as the monarchy's anchor of modernity. But beneath the glamour and the calculated warmth, something harder was taking shape. Reports from reliable outlets, BBC, The Times, even Al Jazeera, began hinting at tension between Clarence House and Buckingham Palace. A leaked memo referenced disagreements regarding the Queen consort's public engagements. Another mentioned concerns about independent correspondence with senior ministers. That was the red line: the monarchy's golden rule forbids interference in governance. Yet Camilla's name was being quietly attached to policy-adjacent initiatives, from cultural diplomacy to mental health funding oversight. William, ever cautious, took notice. He had been raised in a palace that prized discretion above all else, and he recognized the danger of overreach. "She's testing boundaries," he told an aide, according to a leak later confirmed by Reuters. And when you test boundaries in this family, you test history itself. Meanwhile, The press machine kept humming. Photos of Camilla surrounded by admirers filled the tabloids. Public polling showed a modest rise in her approval ratings, especially among older Britons who viewed her as steady and reliable. But those numbers masked a growing unease inside the palace. Anne, usually apolitical, expressed her concerns in her own way by limiting contact by appearing pointedly at engagements without the Queen Consort. Her silence once again spoke volumes. Behind the scenes, Camilla's confidence only grew. Her salon of loyalists began referring to her as Her Majesty the True Stabilizer. Some even whispered that the monarchy would benefit from a regency in spirit if not in name. It was phrasing so bold it bordered on treasonous, yet she allowed it to circulate unchallenged. To silence it would have been to acknowledge it. I recall one night in particular, a dinner at Clarence House, intimate but charged, where a senior advisor raised a toast to the woman who ensures the monarchy endures. Camilla smiled, her eyes catching the light from the chandelier. "It's not endurance," she said softly. "It's stewardship." A harmless word on the surface, but one that suggested ownership, not service. When The Guardian later published an exposé on private influence networks within royal circles, palace insiders scrambled to deny it. But it was too late. The whispers had become stories. The stories had become suspicion. Even the BBC's royal correspondent noted growing internal divergence between the king's household and the Queen Consorts. Charles, ever trusting, remained publicly supportive. But the strain was showing. Meetings once shared became separate. Briefings turned tense. The monarch who had once needed Camilla's strength now found himself shadowed by it. And so, the Queen Consort's quiet campaign, built on charm salons and smiles, had evolved into something dangerous, a monarchy within the monarchy. It was a delicate empire of loyalty and optics, constructed in whispers and laughter. But as history has always warned, empires built in secret crumble fastest when light finally touches them. That light was coming. And when it did, it would expose not just ambition but betrayal. Paper tape betrayal. The exposure began, as these things always do, with a leak. A single envelope appeared one morning at the private office of Sir Julian Marks, the King's principal secretary. It bore no signature, no return address, only the royal crest stamped from an older stationery batch no longer in use. Inside was a typed transcript and a USB drive. The document was titled simply, "Meeting Notes, Clarence House." When Sir Julian played the recording, the first voice he heard was unmistakable. Camilla's low and deliberate. "We cannot depend on a smooth transition," she said. "Continuity must have a structure in place before necessity arises." The rest of the conversation was muffled, but enough survived to be damning. References to trusted allies, discreet briefings, and legacy framing painted a portrait of someone not supporting the throne, but preparing to outlive it. The recording spread like wildfire through the inner corridors of Buckingham. The BBC later described it as the most significant breach of royal privacy since the Windsor Papers. The Guardian called it a seismic moment that transformed whispers into confirmation. When Charles was briefed, the silence that followed was long and heavy. For a man who had spent his life balancing heart and duty, this was a wound that struck both. Still, Charles's first instinct was disbelief. "It must be fabrication," he insisted. "She would never..." His voice trailed off, but the sentence hung unfinished, fragile. Yet the evidence was too precise. Dates matched her private diary, names of attendees corresponded to known associates. The handwriting on the meeting notes, looped and careful, was hers. That evening, William and Anne were called to the palace. I will never forget the sight of them walking down the corridor, two shadows framed by the portraits of ancestors who had faced their own betrayals. William spoke first. "Father, this isn't just optics anymore. It's governance." Anne, characteristically terse, added, "If the monarchy becomes her project, we've already lost it." A second blow came hours later. A Reuters journalist, citing an anonymous palace source, published a piece titled, "Private Strategy Memos Circulate Among Royal Advisors." The article described internal documents outlining contingency scenarios for succession communication. The memos, though unsigned, bore her initials CR for Camilla Regina. Their tone was unmistakably managerial. In the event of incapacity, immediate assurance must be delivered under the Queen Consort's signature to maintain stability. When confronted, Camilla neither denied nor confessed. "We've all been misinterpreted before," she said quietly. "You of all people know that, Charles." Her calm was infuriating, an armor of practiced victimhood. For decades, she had deflected scandal through understatement. But this time, understatement could not contain what had been uncovered. William, unable to contain his anger, demanded she step aside from official duties pending review. She refused. "You think you can strip me of what I've built?" she asked, her tone sharp now. "I've carried this family through storms you could never imagine. I've earned every inch of this crown." Anne stepped forward then. "No one earns a crown," she said. "You inherit it or you protect it, but you never claim it." The words, simple and cold, struck the room like a gavel. The next morning, headlines exploded. The Times ran with palace crisis as secret recordings surface. BBC News aired cautious commentary on allegations of overreach. Al Jazeera was blunter, Camilla accused of building shadow monarchy. The response from Clarence House was a single statement: Her Majesty has always acted in the best interest of the crown. It was technically true and entirely meaningless. Behind the scenes, the crisis deepened. Senior courtiers began resigning from Camilla's circle, some citing ethical concerns, others simply vanishing. Trusted figures who had once shielded her now distanced themselves. Charles, visibly shaken, moved to Balmoral for several days of reflection. He was not seen in public during that time. Deutsche Welle reported that the king's silence speaks louder than denial. It was William who ultimately made the decision. The evidence, the optics, the sheer constitutional risk, it all pointed to the same conclusion. "This isn't about family anymore," he told advisors. "It's about preservation." He arranged a private meeting between his father himself and the Archbishop of Canterbury. The purpose to discuss a formal restriction of the Queen Consort's powers. Camilla, learning of the plan, struck first. In a last attempt to salvage her image, she summoned her remaining confidants to issue what she called a clarification campaign. Carefully worded leaks emphasized her devotion, her long years of loyalty, her deep concern for continuity. But the effort backfired spectacularly. The Guardian ran a scathing editorial: "The Queen Consort's appeal to continuity rings hollow when her very actions have fractured it." That evening, Charles returned to London. His car arrived through the back gate of Buckingham Palace under heavy escort. He entered without fanfare, without photographers, without Camilla waiting at the top of the stairs as she always had. Hours later, he emerged from the private study, pale, aged, and wordless. I learned later that he had listened to the tape himself. All 2 minutes and 43 seconds of it. And when it ended, he reportedly whispered only one sentence: "I trusted her with the crown." The betrayal was no longer rumor. It was recorded, archived, and undeniable. And in the centuries-old history of the monarchy, that kind of truth has only one possible outcome: confrontation, storm, fracture. The palace that morning felt like a fortress under siege. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that comes before thunder. Camilla arrived through the garden entrance, a calculated choice to avoid the press, and was escorted straight to the blue drawing room. Charles was already there, his hands resting on a folder that contained every piece of evidence: the transcript, the memo, and the USB drive that had changed everything. He didn't rise when she entered. For a long time, neither spoke. The only sound was the ticking of the mantel clock echoing against the gilded walls. "You've built something I can no longer protect," he finally said. His voice trembled not with anger, but with exhaustion. "You've turned partnership into power, and power into threat." Camilla's face was unreadable, carved in the composure she had perfected over decades. "Is that what they told you?" she asked softly. "That I'm plotting against you? That after everything I've endured for you, I want your throne?" She moved closer, her voice rising just enough to pierce the air. "They've always despised me, Charles. You know that. They never forgave me for existing." But the king wasn't swayed this time. Years of love and loyalty weighed against a single act of betrayal, and the evidence spoke louder than sentiment. "You weren't meant to lead a court," he said. "You were meant to protect one." Her expression faltered. For the first time in years, the carefully constructed mask slipped. Beneath it was not the calculating queen, but the woman who had fought her way through ridicule, hatred, and scandal. "I was protecting you," she said, her tone breaking. "Every rumor, every headline, they devour you. I built something that could survive them when you couldn't. It might have sounded noble had it not been for the documents on the table." Charles lifted one and placed it in front of her. "You weren't building protection," he said. "You were building succession." That was when William entered. His voice was calm but cold, the voice of a future monarch who had waited too long for restraint. "You've left us no choice," he said. "This must end before it destroys everything Father has built." Camilla turned sharply toward him. "You don't understand what it means to fight for this family," she snapped. "You were born to it. You've never had to earn it." William didn't flinch. "You're right," he replied. "I was born to it. That's why it isn't yours to take." The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with resignation. Camilla stood for a moment longer, then adjusted her jacket, straightened her posture and said simply, "Then do what you must." She left the room as quietly as she had entered. Hours later, BBC News broke the first statement. Her Majesty the Queen Consort will temporarily withdraw from public duties for personal reasons. Reuters confirmed that she would relocate to Ray Mill House for an indefinite period. The phrasing was clinical, but every outlet read between the lines. The Guardian called it a de facto exile, while Al Jazeera described it as a crisis that has shaken the monarchy's moral foundation. Outside the palace, the public reaction was immediate and brutal. Crowds gathered at the gates holding placards that read, "Protect the Crown" and "No Shadow Monarch." Social media erupted with commentary, and even the normally restrained Times ran the headline, "Charles acts to save the throne." Inside, the storm was even worse. Staff were divided between loyalty and survival. Some wept openly. Others shredded documents, deleted emails, or moved offices overnight. The royal press team worked around the clock to control the narrative, but the damage was already global. Anne took charge of the logistics, quietly ensuring that Camilla's personal effects were removed from Windsor and Clarence House. She did so without malice, just efficiency, the same way she handled everything. When asked by Deutsche Welle whether she believed reconciliation was possible, she replied curtly, "We've had reconciliation. What we need now is repair." Charles, meanwhile, retreated into isolation. Those closest to him described him as a man hollowed out. BBC Radio 4 aired a segment quoting a former aide. He looked at her as if realizing that the love which once saved him had finally undone him. The king appeared in public days, later frail but composed, during a charity event at Highgrove. When a reporter shouted a question about the Queen Consort, he offered only 3 words: "The crown endures." The fracture extended beyond family. Commonwealth leaders began to ask quiet questions about stability. Polls showed a rare surge in support for William and Catherine, framed as the future of a restored monarchy. Meanwhile, Camilla's absence became its own kind of presence. Every empty chair beside the king, every engagement conducted alone was a reminder of what had been lost. Privately, her allies continued to defend her. One quoted anonymously in the Telegraph said, "She's no schemer. She's a survivor in a system that's never forgiven her." Another, more cynical, told Reuters she mistook survival for strategy and forgot that in this family, the line between them is fatal. Weeks later, a second recording surfaced, shorter, clearer, impossible to dispute. In it, Camilla's voice said, "When the time comes, they'll need someone steady." That was all. Just one sentence, but enough to destroy any pretense of misunderstanding. The storm, which had begun as whispers of ambition, had now become a public reckoning. Camilla's power, the charm, the composure, the control had evaporated. What remained was silent scandal and the heavy truth that she had gone too far. Yet even in disgrace, she refused to apologize. "History will be kinder," she told a friend before leaving London. "It always is to those who fought for it." As her car disappeared beyond the palace gates, I thought about those words. History may indeed be kinder, but the present mercilessly was not. Exile echoes what endures. The official announcement came a week later, phrased with the cold precision of centuries-old bureaucracy. By order of His Majesty, the King, and upon counsel of the Privy Council, the Queen Consort shall withdraw indefinitely from all royal duties and ceremonial privileges. No emotion, no acknowledgement of scandal. Just a decree, deliberate and final, written in the same measured language that had ended dynasties. Camilla was gone by dawn that same morning. A convoy of black cars left Clarence House under cover of heavy fog, bound for Ray Mill, the estate she had owned long before the crown ever rested near her name. To the public, it was merely geography. To those of us who had watched her rise, it was exile. The BBC covered her departure with restrained empathy, describing her as a figure both formidable and fallible. Reuters framed it as the monarchy's effort to restore public confidence after internal strain. The Guardian said what everyone else wouldn't. Camilla leaves behind a crown she once dreamed of protecting and nearly dismantled. Charles, pale and visibly aged, remained silent. At his next appearance during an environmental summit, he spoke of the weight of stewardship and the lessons of legacy. The words could have been about climate change or something far closer to home. In the weeks that followed, the monarchy recalibrated itself with ruthless efficiency. William and Catherine assumed greater prominence, their public unity projected like an antidote to months of turmoil. Anne's calendar tripled in density as if to remind the world what unshakable duty looked like. And as the palace rebuilt, the mention of Camilla's name grew rarer, reduced to footnotes in speeches and brief acknowledgments in press releases. But away from the cameras at Ray Mill, a different story unfolded. Reporters camped along the country lanes hoping for a glimpse of the woman who had once defied public hatred and rewritten her own story, only to watch it collapse again. Photos trickled in through telephoto lenses, Camilla walking her dogs at dusk, her hair undone, her posture still upright, but weary. She looked not defeated, but emptied. One evening, the Times published an exclusive citing a close friend. The quote read, "She doesn't blame Charles. She blames the machine. The same machine that made her unmade her." It was perhaps the most accurate line written about her, because Camilla's tragedy was not ambition, it was belief. She believed that after decades of endurance, she had finally earned her place. She mistook survival for acceptance, proximity for power. And in the monarchy, those mistakes are fatal. You can survive scandal, you can even survive hate, but you cannot survive mistrust. When the Privy Council met again in early spring, they finalized the redistribution of her roles. Her patronages were reassigned to Catherine and Sophie. Her ceremonial titles quietly revoked. Even the official royal website, that digital testament to hierarchy, replaced her portrait with a line of text, "Former Queen Consort." A phrase that read like both obituary and warning. International reaction was mixed. Al Jazeera called her the latest casualty in a monarchy at war with its own image. Deutsche Welle wrote, "Camilla's fall redefines the boundaries of royal influence for generations to come." The New York Times, ever detached, summarized it as a reminder that monarchy is not love, it is structure. Charles, despite everything, continued to shield her in small ways. She still received a private allowance, still corresponded occasionally with palace staff. But between them stretched an unbridgeable distance, one built not of anger, but of recognition. He had always needed her strength. Now he feared it. I remember seeing them together one last time months later at Balmoral. It was unannounced, unphotographed. She arrived, quietly stayed only 2 days, and left before sunrise. The staff said they dined in near silence. When she left, Charles reportedly stood by the window long after her car disappeared down the drive. "She never understood," he said softly to an aide. "The crown doesn't forgive. It only forgets." In a sense, that became her epitaph, not in marble, but in memory. For all her cunning and composure, Camilla had become what she always feared most, an outsider once more. Yet even in exile, she retained the one quality that had defined her entire life: endurance. She did not vanish. She adapted. She tended her garden, wrote letters to charities she could no longer visit, and refused to let bitterness consume her. Public opinion, as it always does, softened with time. Sympathy replaced outrage. Documentaries began to frame her story as a misunderstood chapter, and biographers debated whether she had been victim architect or both. Polls showed a divided Britain, half condemning her ambition, half admiring her strength. And so history, that impartial judge she had once tried to command, began its slow, inevitable work of revision. In the grand narrative of the monarchy, her name would not stand beside queens who ruled, but beside women who endured those who fought to be heard, failed, and were remembered for the struggle. I sometimes think of her words from years earlier spoken in an interview long before any of this began. I don't want to be adored. I just want to be understood. Perhaps in the end, she got neither. But what she left behind, the caution, the resilience, the ghost of her ambition, became part of the institution itself. The crown survived as it always does. But somewhere in the quiet of Wiltshire, a woman who once stood at its heart walks her garden path at dusk, surrounded by silence she has finally made peace with. She no longer seeks redemption or recognition. She simply endures. And that perhaps is her truest legacy.